Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Holly Kuzmich. I'm Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute. We're really pleased today to be hosting this session on Afghanistan, why we can't look away. I'm going to be joined by a few of my colleagues from the Bush Institute in just a few minutes, but let me set the table for the discussion we're going to have today. We know that obviously this summer, the formal evacuation of our troops, of American citizens, and of Afghans who were eligible for either parole or special immigrant visas really concluded with the wind down in August. But what we want to talk about today is, number one, some of those lessons we've learned about what we saw about those with those evacuation efforts. We also want to talk about why we need to continue to support the people of Afghanistan, what we can do to do that. We're going to particularly talk about some of the at-risk populations who did not make it out of Afghanistan, including many women and children who are vulnerable under Taliban rule. So we're going to explore all of those issues today. This has been a long-standing issue of importance to us at the Bush Institute. We've long supported women in Afghanistan and the gains they've been able to make over the past 20 years, which of course are at risk. We went from having nearly no girls in school back in 2001 to having millions of girls in school earlier this year, and are worried about the backtracking that could occur. We've long talked about the gains they've made, highlighted that for policymakers. To the experts who are joining us here today, we'll talk about the immigration and humanitarian concerns and some policy recommendations that we have for policymakers going forward. And we're also part of an effort called Welcome.us, which is a national effort to welcome and support Afghan families that are resettling to the United States. We will continue to lend our voice and our support to those efforts here in this country. Before we get to our discussion today, we are joined by Onaba Payab. We're going to see a short video from Onaba. Onaba is an Afghan gender equity and education advocate. She is the first female valedictorian of the American University of Afghanistan. She was a Fulbright scholar. She evacuated herself from Kabul in August and has used her voice for many years to advocate for the women of Afghanistan. So before we get into our discussion, let's hear a short video from Onaba.
Good morning, distinguished members of the audience and friends of the Bush Institute. I'm honored to contribute to today's discussion on my homeland, Afghanistan. I would first like to express my gratitude to the men and women from the United States of America and its NATO allies who courageously evacuated hundreds and thousands of Afghans after August 15th. I'm alive today because of those individuals. While the official evacuation effort might have ended on August 31st, our mission remains incomplete. For those that escaped, there is no clarity on when they will be able to continue their life. My own family and friends who served for years the American interest were evacuated to Albania and Qatar. The US Embassy has no guidance from Washington about what will happen to those thousands of people. They were abandoned by the country who they served so faithfully. For those trapped in Afghanistan, the humanitarian crisis looms. Millions are at risk of starvation this winter. The lights will soon flicker off. The jobs have evaporated, and the banks do not work. A lack of clarity in the American policy, as well as the absence of coordination, means that the international aid will not flow to this poor Afghan. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not want the Taliban imposed on us. Global and regional geopolitics brought the Taliban back to power in Afghanistan. The Taliban may walk the streets of Kabul, but they have not and will not the trust of Afghan people. For 20 years, we all worked to create a modern and democratic society, one where millions of girls could attend school and women could have a role in public. I am a product of that Afghanistan. Before the fall of Kabul, millions of girls could attend schools and universities, and we had thousands of female judges and police officers. In 2001, there were 0 Afghan women owned businesses, but in 2020, that number was over 57,000, contributing to the economy of the country. This was a remarkable progress in less than 2 decades. I do not believe for 1 minute that these women will abandon their hopes and dreams for the future, but they alone cannot rebel against Taliban. We want to know if the world still cares about us. Thank you.
Well, Onaba said it best, obviously, on behalf of so many Afghan women. I'm now going to be joined by 2 of my colleagues, Laura Collins and Natalie Gonnella-Platts. Laura is an expert on immigration issues. Natalie has been a longstanding policy expert on issues affecting Afghan women. So Natalie and Laura, thank you both for joining me today. So I want to kick off today's discussion. Laura, I'm first going to turn to you and ask you, make sure we all have a good understanding of what Afghans were eligible to actually evacuate as that ramped up really in the July and August timeframe. Who had that permission for visas? Paint the picture of that population for us.
Sure, thank you. It's an excellent question, as I'm sure many of us, don't work on the immigration space on a day-to-day basis and really don't have a grasp of what's available. So I'll start before the evacuation, when we knew the United States was going to withdraw. And, basically, if you couldn't find a way into the United States or out of Afghanistan otherwise, maybe to one of our allies, through regular immigration processes. For the United States, it would be things like a family member sponsors you because they're a citizen or a green card holder, or you qualify for a work-based green card. Your option was probably just going to be this special immigrant visa process, which was set aside for people who had worked with the US government and military in certain capacities. You hear this often as the interpreters or the translators. There were some people who had other jobs, but basically that's who that is. And that tended to be a heavily male population, given the nature of the work at the time that we started to work in Afghanistan. Towards the beginning of August, we saw the US State Department move to create a new category. It's called P2 under the refugee designations. And what that was for other Afghans who had done really important work. Maybe it was with a government agency from the United States, maybe their project was simply funded by a US agency. Some of those people would then qualify for protection, but that's a 12 to 14-month process. And it requires that you leave Afghanistan first before your paperwork really will be processed. And so what happened with the evacuation, we had a number of people who were eligible for those special immigrant visas. We had some people who were eligible for P2, and then others who just knew they were going to be persecuted by the Taliban, all trying to leave at once. The SIV program has faced years-long backlogs. Often, if you make just a simple mistake in your paperwork, you have to start the process completely over. I mentioned earlier that P2 is a process that normally takes a year. When you start that process August 2nd, you probably aren't going to get that completely done by the time we start evacuating people in the middle of the month in August. And so what we saw were a lot of people trying to file humanitarian parole applications. And what that is it says that we know you don't have a visa to enter the United States, but we're going to vet you and we might let you come in on parole status, which means that you have a year, maybe 2, to come to the United States and request asylum and enter that very backlogged process. If you followed our immigration work, otherwise, you know how we feel about the backlogs in the asylum process. They can take years. And so the options for Afghans were very limited. They remain limited. Right now, basically, if you're an Afghan trying to leave Afghanistan and come to the United States or to one of our allies, you need to have a visa to leave. The nature of the way that the Taliban is controlling travel right now, most Afghans are not able to leave unless they have proof that they have a visa to leave. But you can't complete your visa process for most of these countries unless you have an interview at the embassy. There are no embassy or consular services in Afghanistan if you were trying to come to the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, et cetera. In addition, many of the countries surrounding Afghanistan have a spotty at best record on asylum. So if you're trying to present yourself to one of the countries that borders Afghanistan, you might be turned away. You might get in and then be deported back to Afghanistan. So the options are extremely limited. And as mentioned before, most people who would qualify for an SIV were not women. And so the options in particular for vulnerable women were very slim.
So Natalie, that's a great segue over to you. Talk about the women in particular, and who was left out of those evacuation efforts this summer.
So to summarize, because I think it's really important what Laura mentioned, you are not getting out of Afghanistan. You weren't during the airlift, and you are not today unless you have a visa. And you are not getting a visa until you're out of Afghanistan. And so while there were pathways like P2 introduced, that pathway in and of itself was dependent on a referral. So for women who were actually eligible and others who were eligible, they had to have a connection to the US entity that was able then to refer them, to give them access to an application, which basically says you may be eligible for the P2 pathway out, fill in this information. That is a really small subset. Several thousand individuals were actually eligible for that P2 pathway. And that was specific to women and others who worked, again, for projects or affiliated organizations that were funded through institutions like USAID, the State Department, other US entities. That did not include a lot of other women who were really critical catalysts for the peace and stability we saw across a 20-year period in Afghanistan. And I think it's really important to contextualize it in this way. Afghan women achieved more in 20 years than most women's movements achieved across multiple decades. And that's really important because it's a critical part of the women, peace, and security agenda. So often, and you look at, the focus on SIVs here, we think about women, peace, and security solely within the context of traditional national security or military-related endeavors, but it's so much more than that. And so these are women who were contributing directly on education projects, healthcare projects, gender equity and justice projects. These are things that we know, and that when women have full and equal active participation in society, societies are more prosperous and stable. We would not have seen the progress we saw across the last 20 years in Afghanistan if it were not for these women like Onaba and several others who I know are joining us on the call today. Unfortunately, because of the limitations of P2, they were ineligible if they weren't directly working for a US funded project. So what types of women am I talking about, right? There are women special forces, ANA special forces, women who valiantly served in the military or who also served as police officers who are ineligible for the P2 pathway. These are women who worked for international organizations in support of endeavors that directly benefit stability and security here in the United States. For example, we know of a woman who worked for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, specifically on counter narcotics trafficking. 80% of the heroin that comes, Afghanistan is responsible for 80% of the heroin that we see exported globally. 95% of that actually enters Europe and the UK. She was ineligible for the P2 pathway. And I bring up that example because opioids and heroin are a huge revenue source for the Taliban and other nefarious actors. These are women who are educators, who are students, who are journalists. We know education is so critical to the stability and security of countries, and yet they still were ineligible for a pathway to safety. These are women judges. They are women provincial counselors, women who are so critical at the local level for standing up infrastructure, and they did not have a safe pathway out. And it's worth mentioning this because right now, they still have no safe pathway out. And because of the very nature of the work they undertook, they are at risk of serious harm or death at the hands of the Taliban, ISIS-K, and others.
So Natalie and Laura, I want to talk to you a little bit about what we know about how many people sort of fall into these categories. What do we know, if anything, about how many women were never eligible, who deserved who worked in these, high-risk positions and deserve our support? And then Laura, on your side, in terms of people who, are actually eligible for parole or SIV status, who never were able to get out over this summer period, do we have a sense for how many people this is?
Unfortunately, like in so many other instances of conflict and humanitarian crises, data is limited. And what is happening in Afghanistan right now is yet another testament to why data and disaggregated data is really so critical for effective interventions and solutions. And I want to stress that disaggregated data points, because in the face of humanitarian crises and conflict, and particularly also when you add immigration in the mix, there are very gendered differences here. And so unfortunately, we don't have good estimates of exactly who was left behind. And those that we are aware of are women who had access to the applications and the information on how to apply, or they had the connections and the network of folks who have been very courageously advocating on their behalf. So I think of what is known right now in terms of what has been filed with the Department of State and other lists that may exist, that actually is very likely a small snapshot of the true scope of those who are at risk and those who would likely be eligible for evacuation.
Yeah, before the evacuation started, the discussions around the SIV population in the backlog were something like about 18,000 SIV eligible individuals, but that didn't include their family members. When you include their immediate family members who are eligible to join them, you're getting into the tens of thousands, 70 to 80,000 people. In terms of the parole population, first I want to say parole has never been intended to be the sort of thing that is the primary way that someone seeks protection. It's the safety valve. It's an extra piece. And so that's, when you look at the population of Afghanistan and you look at what the Taliban is capable of and the depraved conduct we all know that they have continued to do, you're really looking at the vast majority of Afghans, if they were able to escape, would probably be eligible for refugee protections in most countries that adhere to the UN refugee guidelines, just because they would be persecuted under our own laws, the Refugee Act of 1980. We know that many of these people would qualify to be refugees in the United States. The women piece is harder because we know gender itself, simply being a woman is not a basis for protection, although we can all imagine why simply being a woman should be a basis of protection when you're talking about a country like Afghanistan and what the Taliban continues to perpetuate against women on a daily basis. And so it's hard to wrap our arms around the scope of the problem, the scope of the number of people who need protection. And so, when you look at some of the things that we've done and said on this topic, particularly on the immigration piece, we estimate that there will be tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of Afghans who will attempt to flee or will try to reach safety in another country. That doesn't mean they're all going to come to the United States, but we know that millions will always remain in Afghanistan. Not everybody has the means to get out. And so that's why we really do advocate for, reforms on the immigration side to try to make sure we are offering protection to the people who deserve it and who have the ability to get here and who have a connection here. And also the international community offering protection to the others. We know that there are so many people who will need resettlement. But then what do we do to, address the humanitarian situation on the ground for the millions who just simply will not be able to get out?
Natalie, since I want to talk about what we know on the ground. I mean, obviously, we're talking in part about women who are at high risk and we think deserve support and still being able to get out of the country. But as Laura also mentioned, I mean, Afghanistan's a large country and so many Afghans are going to remain in Afghanistan. For the women who are there, what do we know since the Taliban has come back into power about how they're treating women and decisions they've made?
Today actually marks the 1 month anniversary of the initial ban, the temporary ban on secondary education. And I think that's a really important place to start because 25 years ago, we saw exactly the same approach. I often compare what's going on today to movies, right? We've seen this movie before. Sequels are very rarely better. They just have more villains. And I think that's a really fitting metaphor for what's going on in Afghanistan. The Taliban did exactly the same thing 25 years ago. It's not just education. We've also seen women barred from employment. There is not one woman represented in the current leadership. We have seen women beaten in the streets who have protested for their rights. We have seen women beaten for leaving their homes not fully covered to the current standards that the Taliban has imposed or leaving their homes without a male escort. We also saw, I mean, these are not things that, you know, overnight have happened either. You know, over the course of this year, we have seen telling signs of what was to come. You know, women in particular were targets for threats, harassment, assassination, kidnappings. You know, there were female vaccination healthcare workers who were assassinated. There have been journalists who have been assassinated. There was the attack on the girls' school earlier this year. We know of so many female advocates who were working from home, not because of the impact of COVID-19, because of the very apparent threats that they faced, even prior to the events of this summer. So what is happening right now is exactly who the Taliban are. And one of the questions I think a lot of us who are working on this gets from the media and others is, do you think the Taliban has changed? What we are seeing today is the same we saw a quarter century ago. So, you know, the temporary bans they put in place 25 years ago lasted, you know, 4 to 5 years until 2001. So why there would be any indication, the Ministry of the Interior said today that they're working on the secondary education ban, but it's been a month already.
We've more specific about, for people who don't know what the ban is. I mean, say more about what the ban is and what they mean when they say they're working on it.
Yeah, that's, well, the second part of that question, I think, is a very good question in and of itself. What does that mean, right? We've only seen lip service to that. But in terms of the ban on education, the Taliban at the moment have permitted education for boys and girls up to the age of 6th grade. They need to be in gender segregated classrooms, and the curriculum across the education system is currently up for review. From 6th grade onward, girls are essentially banned from access to secondary education, the equivalent of, you know, middle school, high school, as well as tertiary education, which would be university level. This is exactly, again, what we saw, you know, a quarter century ago. So right now you have not just students at home without access to education, but you have teachers who have been not able to go and you know, pursue their vocation. And that's important to note as well, because a lot of women are the primary breadwinners for their family. So this not just has a knock-on effect for the economic status or the educational status of this women, this has a real ripple effect as well for the families that they are a part of, and the broader communities that they are a part of. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the humanitarian crisis a little bit later, so don't want to get into those figures yet, but you know, there's a real knock-on effect to not just the ban on girls' secondary education. And the other thing I want to note here is this is a classic page out of the tyrant's playbook. You know, it's not just the Taliban who leveraged inaccessibility to education. Khmer Rouge, you know, China restricts access to information. We saw the Nazis and the Soviets restrict access to information and education. Look at North Korea. So what the Taliban is doing right now is essentially limiting information and limiting the knowledge base of the population, because it essentially makes it easier for them to implement the brutality and the oppression that they are so widely known for.
So Natalie, let's paint the picture of the humanitarian crisis that's happening. What's happening on the ground?
Where do we start? So the latest figures show that 95% of households across Afghanistan are essentially food insecure. Families are reporting they don't have enough to eat. Already, if you Google Afghanistan and malnutrition, there are photos from the last week, utterly devastating pictures of children who are severely malnourished. UNICEF figures currently report that half of all under 5s in Afghanistan are at risk of severe acute malnutrition. And by December of this year, without access to adequate treatment, 1 million children will die from malnutrition. This is important to note because the impact of the food scarcity and water scarcity issues is not just a result of the political situation in Afghanistan and the instability in Afghanistan, but you also have one of the worst droughts that the country has seen. They've not seen the droughts of this nature in 3 decades. So on top of the instability that continues to unfold, you have other factors at play that are really having an impact on the status of Afghan families. There are things as well. Afghanistan still has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. That dropped 60% since 2001. That is an incredible, incredible achievement. But without access to skilled birth providers, basic levels of maternal health care, there are serious concerns for the rapid increase of maternal death, of infant death. And this is something that we really, really need to be aware of, because frankly, the Taliban have already stated that their view of women is that they should stay home and give birth. But how are women even able to do that without access to adequate healthcare facilities? We know that polio remains an issue. We know that issues like measles remain an issue. We know that COVID-19 has significantly had an impact on the country and across a number of waves. And then there's also the liquidity crisis and the fact that the economic system is basically on the verge of collapse. And that is something that is impacting Afghans, not only within Afghanistan, but also those who have been able to leave and are either here in the United States or idling elsewhere until they have a location for their final resettlement. 97% of Afghans are at risk of falling into poverty by the middle of next year. And I think that statistic in and of itself really demonstrates the scope of desperation, destitution, and just real concern of what is unfolding on the ground in Afghanistan.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for outlining that. Laura, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about people who are able to evacuate. Talk a little bit about what that immigration process has looked like for them over the coming months, and what are all the challenges that are still out there as we think about people who were able to get out.
So there's sort of two different populations of people who were able to get out, and that's the people who were evacuated during the airlift process, and then there are the people who have managed to get themselves out of the country since then. And for the people who were evacuated during the airlift process, regardless of what they qualify for otherwise, whether it was an SIV, a P2, they were a family member of the United States citizen or green card holder, those people have all been undergoing the parole process. And parole just basically means, we know you don't have a visa in hand, but we're going to vet you. We have a very robust security vetting process. And then once we determine that you are safe and that we can trust that you are who you say you are, then you enter the United States. And because Congress passed some funding during the last budget negotiations, there is a resettlement process for those people in parole. But at the moment, they're in asylum proceedings. They have a year to 2 years to enter the asylum system and try to win protection that way. And what that means is they're in a very long process. It could be years long. And in the absence of some sort of action by Congress to give them a special category to speed up a green card process for them, they will be stuck in an asylum process for a number of years. What that means is they will be eligible to work after a certain point. They have to apply with the US government to get a permit to do so, but they're not eligible for the vast majority of things that might help someone try to rebuild their lives. They're not eligible for any entitlement benefits. They really have very little access to any of the safety net programs. And so, they're on their own and they're navigating a system that is complex, that is extremely backlogged. They aren't, while they could have legal representation, we don't appoint anybody to help them. And so they're at the mercy of a system that is frankly confusing for anyone, even someone who's sophisticated in the processes of US immigration. For those who have managed to evacuate themselves, many of them are simply in a refugee process. Once you leave, you request asylum from the country you're in, and then you hopefully have the ability to reach a UNHCR office or an embassy from the United States or another of the allies and start a refugee process there. There's a whole referral process there, and that can take years. You may be stuck in a host country for years before you are permanently resettled. There will absolutely be some people who end up in refugee camps and all of what that entails. But even those people go through a very robust security vetting process. I think it's something like 14 steps for your average refugee. And so we know that all of the people who end up resettled in the United States will end up being people that we know well, that we trust, that we consider to be good, upstanding members of society who will be contributors. And so that is sort of the process that we're looking at. We've got 2 tracks here for those who managed to be evacuated. And not all of them are in the United States yet. Not all of them have finished their vetting process. Some of them still remain in third country, what are known as lily pad sites. Others, as some of you have seen on the news, are at various military bases in the United States. And really that is just about making sure that we can support them the best way that we can while we finish their paperwork and their process. And then once they are out, refugee resettlement groups will help with this, private citizens will help with this, other nonprofits. We all have a real role to play to help these people rebuild their lives. And so that is the process that will play out over the next several months.
Laura, respond to, you just mentioned security vetting, and that issue has come up in this discussion. And in many ways it's come up because there was speed, right? People were evacuating faster than any normal circumstance, and that has led to some questions and concerns about, are we vetting people as we let them into the United States? Talk a little bit more about what you know about that process.
Well, for any of you watching today that have followed our immigration work, you know that there are a number of things that we wish to change about the immigration process. And we often say that, things are inefficient or they don't work or they're broken. Vetting is not one of those places. We are very good at security vetting in the United States, particularly on immigrants. And you should rest assured that secure vetting is in place for these parolees as well. We don't allow anyone into the country who we haven't vetted. And because there are multiple steps to the process, you may have seen some news reports where, someone we did admit was picked up as soon as they were released because there was an outstanding warrant because they'd been in the United States before. That's an indication of a system that's working, that where the checks and balances, everybody's got sort of a backstop, each agency. And so this is a system that really does work. For those who aren't admissible to the United States, they're either going to be returned to Afghanistan. Maybe there's another country where they would be admissible, and the United States government will work to try to find where they should go next. But anyone who is not otherwise admissible to the United States is not getting in.
Can I just add something there as well? And this is not by any means meant to be seen as a supplement to vetting, but I just want to reiterate the point too, that there has never been any other group, a large mass migration group, who has had such an affinity from the outset for the core ideals that we hold so dear as Americans. So many of the Afghans we described earlier in this webinar are at risk because they supported us, they stood with us when we needed them, and they were very invested in common ideals of equity, justice, human rights, freedom, democracy. And so I think that that's really important to call out here, and that is something that is often overlooked in the messaging of this particular refugee population in particular. Again, it's not meant to be seen as an override to the very important vetting processes that exist, but it is worth mentioning because this group is special, and they very much believe in so much of what we believe as Americans.
Let's talk a little bit about what successful resettlement looks like for Afghans coming to the country. Natalie or Laura, either of you can weigh in on this, but what does that look like, and how can we all support a successful resettlement?
Well, I'll start, and I'll say that we in the United States do a very good job on resettlement. Typically, there is a robust process. It's time tested. Refugee populations typically are able to be self-sufficient within a matter of months. They get just a little bit of support at the beginning. Obviously, as we talked about the banking crisis, many start out with nothing because they've had to leave their homes. Their skills and education don't necessarily translate to American occupations because of our licensing restrictions and other restrictions on work here. And again, some of them just simply don't have access to the savings they've had for their entire lives. So there's a short period of time by which they get some assistance, both with benefits and also with some cash. We help them find housing. And then within 3 to 6 months, we expect them to be self-sufficient. We expect them to work. And these resettlement agencies do the lion's share of really trying to help integrate these people into society. But there's a big role to play for all the rest of us as well, whether that is helping these resettlement agencies in some way through volunteer work, and also just being a friend to someone that you meet. If you're a business owner, looking at your employment practices and seeing if there are areas where you could take in someone who maybe needs a little bit of training but is ready to contribute. If you know someone in your faith community or your children's school, maybe there's a refugee family in your neighborhood, doing what you can to really just be a good American citizen and helping them navigate some of the things that are going to be different for them that wouldn't necessarily exist in their home country. I think a lot about upcoming winter for people who are going to be settled in colder climates, or storm season for those of us from the Midwest. We know what that looks like, and really helping them bridge those things that they may not have encountered otherwise.
I would add to that, there's the reality that this is a population who has endured significant trauma. And so they need our love, they need our welcome. And I would encourage folks to understand, in addition to the tangible items that are so needed, and the basic access to service and support that are so needed, to think about that and what we can do as communities to welcome these folks who have endured an unbelievable journey to get here. I also want to underscore the fact that there are some gender differences here as well, and that the needs of women and girls is something that needs its due attention in the resettlement efforts. And so that is certainly a place where there is a lot of room to grow. The last thing I'll add as well is, in addition to how you can support within your local community and here in the United States, as we have mentioned, so many Afghans are also idling outside of the United States on where they will resettle eventually. And going back to the liquidity crisis, they left with the shirts on their backs. They have no access to their credit cards. Their bank accounts are inaccessible. So essentially, they're without any access to resources for 6 months to a year to 2 years. And there are a lot of organizations and agencies and efforts that are going to be very needed outside of our own country as well, to ensure that these folks, don't get left behind, don't fall prey to nefarious actors and things like trafficking and exploitation.
Laura and Natalie, I'm going to ask you to do this in pretty short order. For policymakers, what are the big recommendations you have, both in terms of continuing to ease sort of the immigration resettlement process, and then also continue to support, those who are still in Afghanistan?
Well, I'll go on the immigration piece first. Domestic policymakers should really think about the ways that they can reduce the hurdles that exist, the very practical hurdles that exist to people being able to get a visa. An Afghan who qualifies, even if they work for, if they qualify for a work visa or a family-based visa or humanitarian protection, they can't finish that process once they're in Afghanistan because they can't finish the consular and embassy interviews. Trying to do their biometrics is, especially with consular services being so backed up and so limited due to COVID, even if people make it to a third country, those biometric appointments can take a long time to even get in a line. There's just some very practical things that the agencies could do to try to reduce those hurdles. In addition, it would be very helpful. USCIS is completely backlogged right now, not just with humanitarian parole applications, but also with regular green cards. We know that USCIS could use an injection of some funding, at least temporarily, to help them staff up, to help them really make that process work more smoothly. One of the things that I think is really important, Congress already did, which is great, which is that funding to help Afghans resettle. Parolees would not normally qualify for resettlement funds, but that is there. And then there is always this talk about how do we speed up the green card process for Afghans. And, to Natalie's point earlier about these being people who bought in and they contributed and they did the hard work in their country for 20 years about, they share our values. And so, being able to help them fully integrate, have the opportunity to become Americans quicker, I think is an important thing for Congress to undertake. And I would like to see them start to work on that in the next couple of weeks, because it is so important. Otherwise they're going to languish in this asylum backlog in a way that's unfair to them. They didn't choose to try to get into our millions long asylum backlog. And so to the extent that we can ease that pressure for them, I think it's really important.
Natalie, what would you add to that?
So I mentioned it earlier. I think data is really important here. And again, Laura outlined the very extensive vetting process that we have. So the data exists. We need it disaggregated, and we need access among civil society organizations in particular so that we can best respond to the problem at hand. I would also add, not just at the level of US influencers, but global influencers, we need to really double down on our humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. And that includes the establishment of a humanitarian corridor, which I think is highly controversial, of course, but we need that both for aid to flow in, as well as to ensure that there are ways that people can safely leave who want to and choose to leave. That remains one of the biggest challenges for at-risk Afghans, is that they, again, don't have a way to leave the country. I would also notate that, both the United States as well as the international community have for decades indicated our commitment to the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, to topics of gender equity from 1325 to our own Women, Peace, and Security Act here in the United States and the national strategy around that. We have here codified into law that the status of women and girls matters. And we really need to put some action behind our words on that, because Afghanistan right now is yet another demonstration of how we as an international community have unfortunately failed time and time again. And that is obviously a really hard nut to crack. But the agency of women and girls in Afghanistan matters. The agency of women and children outside of Afghanistan matters. And there are so many, international conventions and different policies that already exist that just haven't been put into place. And we're seeing the fallout of that unfold very rapidly in Afghanistan. So I think that that's really important. I think we really need to recommit to what we have meant and mean for the future in terms of gender equity and women, peace, and security.
Okay, we've got a couple questions coming in, and I may combine some of them in an effort to be efficient. So let me put these two together. If somebody's asking about how we can continue to evacuate vulnerable Afghans if the Taliban's effectively closed the borders and not allowing freedom of travel, and then I'm going to combine that with a question from somebody on the Hill asking about constituents who have family stuck in Afghanistan, and what do we do either, and what should we be encouraging policymakers to do on those two fronts?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult question, right? Because practically speaking, it's people just need to find a way out of Afghanistan before they can really start a resettlement process anywhere or try to get somewhere where they eventually want to be. And that's tough. It's really difficult to tell a family member, sorry, there's very little the US government can do for you. But at the moment, there's very little the US government can do for you through formal channels. I think that's one of the main reasons we've really emphasized that humanitarian corridor. If there's a way for the United States and the international community to come together, give people who really do need to leave Afghanistan the opportunity to do so, that's really important. And also it's and not just that, you look around, I mentioned before, you look around the map of around Afghanistan, and not a lot of countries there particularly friendly on asylum. How US and its allies works through diplomatic channels to make sure that there is a haven for people who need to get out and the ability for them to get out and in a surrounding country, and also supporting those countries. They don't have the infrastructure that we do to be receiving countries for migrants. What do we do to help them in the short term be able to be a receiving country, knowing that not all those Afghans will stay there? They do want to transit to other places, but that's an important safety valve there, because when you're talking about trying to evacuate people without a formal visa process because they can't access it and they can't complete it, asylum is one of those important places.
But I would add here, and obviously we've just summarized our recommendations, and not to plug our recommendations, but we are all invested in individuals that we very much care about, we love, we want to see them safe. And that work is so incredibly laudable and it's so incredibly hard, but I cannot stress enough the importance of collaboration and cross-pollination and really ensuring that we are all pushing for the same types of policies at scale that will not only help those we care so deeply about, but that will help all at-risk Afghans. Because, saving 60 people is wonderful. Saving 60,000 is even better. And, we're in an environment where special designations are not happening. But we have the power to move the needle on really critical changes that could make a difference, a life and death difference for tens of thousands of at-risk Afghans. So I would encourage everyone on this call to check out our policy recommendations. You're doing a really incredible first step in joining us for this webinar as well, in opening those pathways to have important dialogue. And I would encourage us all to continue to do so. We have seen it be so beneficial in so many circumstances. And you know, in some of our other work here at the Bush Institute that we do with First Ladies, one of my favorite quotes is, you know, change happens when we break down silos and work together. And I cannot stress that enough in terms of what is happening right now with this situation.
So Natalie, we had two kind of related questions come in. One was about effective ways to continue providing humanitarian assistance, but being able to bypass the Taliban, because obviously we don't want to be going through them to do that. And then there was another talking about, you know, should we be insisting on human rights reforms as conditions for any sort of aid? What's been the discussion there? Do you have any thoughts on this topic?
This is actually a topic that we have paid close attention to, not just in terms of what's going on in Afghanistan, but, you know, there are parallel circumstances in other places as well, like Central America, where there are folks on the ground who are doing good work and who have done incredible work for a very long time. And we know that a lot of these organizations and their staff valiantly continue to do this work. And so I do think that there are ways in which we can continue to channel humanitarian assistance, and that assistance very much is needed to be increased. Winter is coming. This upcoming weekend, it will be close to freezing in Kabul alone, let alone in the more mountainous regions. And so finding ways in which we can support the institutions that have a longstanding footprint, that are not part of the, you know, they're not part of the Taliban. That's why they face the risks that they do in doing the work that they do. You know, there are a number of them, in addition to institutions like the World Food Program, UNICEF, others. You know, UNICEF was facing a funding shortfall in terms of the deliverables that were needed to meet needs on the ground. And so these are organizations that I think folks on this call who are interested in helping, not, you know, it's not just about channeling resources to resettlement efforts, but also channeling resources to the humanitarian assistance organizations that have proven outputs and proven impact in country. And, you know, humanitarian assistance, it's hard work. It's not easy. There are a lot of challenges and barriers that persist, but we know that so many folks who have had a longstanding impact in Afghanistan remain committed to doing whatever they can to help as many people as possible. And, you know, but they need the support, they need the resources to do so. I will say too that, and this is an area that where I don't have as much expertise. I know that there are a lot of conversations as well talking about, you know, how we can get around some of the challenges that exist in getting those resources, especially to local organizations who may not have the scope and reach of, you know, a UNICEF, a World Food Program, a CARE, others of that scope and scale. I know CSIS has been really great in leading that dialogue. They have a fantastic working group in that regard that focuses a lot on the humanitarian assistance side of things. So, you know, there are other resources out there for those who are curious, and I'm happy to share those outside of this conversation if helpful.
Natalie, you also mentioned the real banking issues that are going on, and, you know, access to money. Can you say a little bit more about, you know, the issue of the Afghan central bank being frozen? We had a question come in on this, and, you know, what do we do about that? How do we work around that challenge?
It's a really big challenge. And I know, for example, that China has been advocating for, you know, the billions in dollars of reserves to be unfrozen because, you know, they're stating that will obviously solve the humanitarian crisis on the ground, which many of us know not to be the case. You know, just for scope for people who may not be aware, right now Afghans are able to withdraw about $200 a week, but that in and of itself isn't happening. You know, we've heard from folks on the ground that it's maybe $50 if they're lucky. So to put that into context, you know, people who are able to leave are leaving with whatever cash they've been able to withdraw and other resources they may have saved. And then once they're out of Afghanistan, they have no access to their bank card, essentially isn't working at all. So that's really important to note. I don't have an answer for that specifically on how we address the challenge, but I will say that's an opportunity for all of us to step up to support those, not just who are being resettled, not just those who are idling in third countries, and not just those who are on the ground feeling the impact of the humanitarian crisis. Again, resources and channeling your time and your talents and your energies to so much of the good work that is happening in support of Afghanistan is really critical in bypassing that very, very serious banking challenge that is going to persist. I had a very close friend say, essentially, I had 10 years of savings. It's gone. It's frozen. And if it ever gets unfrozen, she was fully expecting then the Taliban to take control of her accounts. I mean, think about that.
And she's in a country where she has the ability to work. Like, she's going to get a work permit. There are people who will end up resettled in countries where they will never have a formal work permit because their asylum systems don't accommodate that. And so they're going to be trying to work, under the table and scrape by in extreme poverty. And because not every country is going to have a resettlement process or an asylum system that allows people to work. And so it's important that we think about that too. People do want to work, they're going to eventually find jobs, but not every country is going to be accommodating in that way.
I will add too to the scale of just how bad the banking crisis is on the ground, how horrible the level of starvation is on the ground. I mean, you read any news report that details the growing poverty, and there are parents who are having to make the decision to literally sell their children. And there are multiple accounts of this for small sums of like $500 that they owe their debtors because they needed to buy food for the rest of the family. I mean, think about that. And it has been, what are we, 2 months since the fall of Kabul? I mean, I cannot even comprehend what the next few months are going to look like for the people on the ground in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So as we've watched all of this unfold over the past several months, one of the questions many Americans raise is they see how quickly that the gains that everybody fought for have been reversed. And it's made many people question sort of whether foreign investments are worth it. How would you all respond to that?
So my view of that question is exactly the opposite. Because again, as I said at the start, in 20 short years, we saw remarkable gains in Afghanistan, not just for women, but for the whole of society. And development takes time. Democracy is messy. These aren't things that happen overnight. And, Afghanistan had a long way to go, but it was on the right path. And for me, this isn't a question of whether these gains were worth it. I think what has happened in Afghanistan really is a testament to why foreign assistance is so important and why we need more of it, and why U.S. leadership internationally is so critical. I don't think there is another example out there that really demonstrates what is possible in a short period of time when you really commit to the resources and the collaboration that are needed. And there's a Twitter thread right now from a very famous Afghan journalist asking Afghans to post their what they were doing before August 15th and what they are doing now. And I've retweeted it, I believe Laura has as well. But if you take a look at it and you look at just the diversity of contributions and backgrounds and the things that people were able to do over the course of the last 20 years, it's really remarkable. And it truly is a testament to what it was possible. And so I absolutely think that all of the foreign investments were worth it. And I think this shows us, as I said before, why, we really need to double down on our engagement internationally.
Yeah. Okay. Laura, do you want to add something quickly? And then I want to get to our final question.
Yeah, foreign assistance is such a small percentage of our budget. We get a lot out of it. And stability and security abroad is stability and security at home. It's simple math for us.
So we got a lot of questions, and we have gotten this question over many months, and I know we all feel this personally. We've talked a lot about policy issues today, but people want to know what they can do individually to help, either financially or, otherwise in their communities. What advice would you give them?
I feel like it's such a big question. Normally what I would say, particularly in the immigration space, is leadership, personal leadership on this, in your homes, in your neighborhoods, in your faith communities, in your places of work. What can you do as an individual, both to make sure it's good fact-based information going out to your networks, to make sure people know and understand the issues that are facing Afghans being resettled, and also just taking a look at what you personally do and how you can have an impact, whether that is being an advocate or just a friend to an Afghan family, or really looking at your own business and how you can contribute to the resettlement efforts.
You need your time, your talent, your passion. The only other thing I'll add there too is the news cycle has changed. The realities on the ground have not. And so, we all have outlets and windows into the world. And so where you're able, share the stories, share the voices of Afghans who have experienced the evacuation, the resettlement process. Share the stories of those who are on the ground enduring, the unfolding humanitarian crisis. We have a responsibility and a commitment to do so. And every time we do that, it's a small act of defiance against the Taliban.
Okay, well, Laura and Natalie, thank you both. Thanks to our audience for some great questions today. You all heard Natalie and Laura mention our policy recommendations that we put out within the past several weeks for policymakers on things they can do to continue to support this population. It's going to be something we talk about long into the future, and we're grateful for everybody's interest. So thank you all for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.